Introduction. There are stories that the world has tried to forget, mysteries buried beneath time, yet still whispering through history. Vanished crews, strange letters, toxic rain, and disappearances that defy all logic. Each tale you're about to hear is true, and each will leave you wondering how such things could ever happen. Tonight, let's journey through the forgotten corners of reality, through stories so chilling and unexplainable, they'll linger in your thoughts long after the video ends. The Dyatlov Pass Incident. In the winter of 1959, 9 experienced hikers set out on an expedition through the Ural Mountains of the Soviet Union. Their goal was Mount Otorten, a name that in the language of the local Monsey people meant, "Don't go there." The leader, Igor Dyatlov, was a respected student from the Ural Polytechnic Institute, known for his meticulous planning and discipline. The group consisted of skilled young men and women in their 20s, all trained in survival under harsh conditions. None of them could have imagined that this journey would end as one of the most enduring mysteries of the 20th century. The team left from the small settlement of Villisca on January 27th. They carried skis, food, tents, journals, and a camera to document their adventure. For the first few days, everything seemed normal. They made steady progress through dense forests and frozen rivers, smiling for photographs and writing cheerful entries in their diaries. On February 1st, they began their climb toward the mountain pass that would later bear Dyatlov's name. The weather turned severe, strong winds, snowstorms, and temperatures dropping below -30 degrees Celsius. Visibility was poor, and they accidentally veered west, toward the slopes of Koletsyakal, the Mountain of the Dead, another ominous name from Monsey folklore. Realizing their mistake, Dyatlov decided to camp right there on the exposed slope instead of turning back to the forest for shelter. Perhaps he didn't want to lose altitude. Perhaps he wanted to prove something to his team or to himself. That decision sealed their fate. When they failed to return as scheduled, search parties were dispatched. It took rescuers weeks to find the campsite, and what they discovered defied explanation. The tent was still standing, but it had been cut open from the inside. All the hikers' belongings, boots, jackets, and gear, were neatly left inside, as if they had fled in panic. Bare footprints led away from the tent into the deep snow, disappearing into the forest below. About a kilometer away, under a tall cedar tree, rescuers found the first 2 bodies, barefoot, wearing only underwear. Between them lay the remains of a small fire. Broken branches suggested they had tried to climb the tree, perhaps seeking shelter or to spot the camp. 3 more bodies were discovered halfway between the tree and the tent, frozen in poses that looked like they were crawling back towards safety. Their expressions were peaceful, yet their deaths were sudden. 2 months later, after the snow began to melt, the remaining 4 hikers were found deeper in the ravine. Their injuries were far more severe: skull fractures, crushed ribs, and internal trauma equivalent to a car crash. Yet there were no external wounds. One woman was missing her tongue. Some of the clothing tested positive for radiation. There were no signs of struggle, no footprints of strangers, no evidence of an attack. The investigators were left with fragments of a puzzle that refused to fit together. The official Soviet report concluded only that a compelling natural force had caused their deaths. But what kind of force could drive 9 intelligent, disciplined people to tear open their tent and run barefoot into a blizzard? Over the decades, countless theories have emerged. An avalanche, military tests, infrasonic panic, a lightning strike, or even something beyond human understanding. Yet none fully explains the details: the radiation, the missing tongue, the lack of avalanche traces. Recently, modern simulations have suggested that a small slab avalanche might have triggered panic, crushing some of the group and forcing the others into disoriented flight. It is a rational explanation, grounded in physics and terrain modeling. And yet, for many, it still fails to capture the human strangeness of that night. The quiet terror that left those footprints in the snow, leading from a torn tent into the dark silence of the mountain. When rescuers finally packed up the last bodies, they left a small memorial cross at the site. The pass was named after Igor Dyatlov, forever linking his name with mystery. The diaries, photos, and recovered items were stored away in archives, But the story never rested. Each winter, the wind still howls across that slope, echoing through the empty tent and the cold, endless snow. It is a reminder of how fragile human certainty becomes in the face of nature's indifference, and how some mysteries are meant to stay unanswered. The Hinterkaifeck Murders. In the quiet countryside of Bavaria, Germany, there once stood a small farmstead known as Hinterkaifeck. It was isolated, surrounded by dark woods and distant fields, several kilometers from the nearest village. In March of 1922, this peaceful farmhouse became the setting for one of the most chilling and unexplained crimes in European history, a case that continues to unsettle even a century later. The family who lived there was ordinary by all outward appearances. Andreas Gruber, his wife Cecilia, their daughter Victoria, and Victoria's 2 young children carried out their daily work tending to the land and animals. They were reserved, hard-working people who rarely ventured far beyond their property. Yet in the months before the tragedy, strange events began to disturb the calm rhythm of their lives. Andreas Gruber had told neighbors that he was hearing footsteps in the attic at night. He searched the house repeatedly but found nothing. Fresh footprints were seen leading from the forest to the farm after a snowfall, yet none led back. A set of keys disappeared. The family dog barked incessantly at empty corners. They spoke of these events quietly, perhaps embarrassed to admit their unease. But unease had already settled into the walls of Hinterkaifeck. On the evening of March 31st, 1922, something terrible happened. Over the following days, neighbors noticed that the farm seemed unusually silent. The Grubers had not attended church, nor had Victoria's children shown up for school. The mail piled up. Concern grew until April 4th, when several townspeople decided to investigate. What they found inside would haunt them for the rest of their lives. In the barn lay 4 bodies: Andreas, Cecilia, Victoria, and her daughter, also named Cecilia. They had been drawn there one by one, perhaps by noise or suspicion, and struck down with a heavy farm tool known as a mattock. Inside the house, in their beds, were the bodies of the youngest child, 2-year-old Joseph, and the maid Maria Baumgartner, who had arrived to work at the farm only the day before. 6 lives, all taken in one night. But it was what came after that deepened the mystery. The killer or killers had stayed on the farm for days. The cows were milked, food was eaten, the fireplace still warm. Someone had lived among the dead, maintaining a ghostly routine as if nothing had happened. There were no signs of forced entry, no valuable possessions missing. It seemed as though whoever committed the murders had no purpose beyond the act itself. The police investigation stretched on for years, marked by confusion and false leads. Dozens of suspects were questioned: neighbors, drifters, former lovers, even family members. Victoria was rumored to have had an affair with a local man, and her relationship with her father was whispered about in tones of scandal. Yet despite the gossip, no one could be tied to the scene with any certainty. The murder weapon was found later hidden in the attic, as if the house itself had swallowed it. The strangeness of Hinterkaifeck lies not only in the brutality of the crime, but in its atmosphere. A sense that something unseen lingered on that land long before the night of the murders. The farm's isolation turned it into its own small world, one that ended abruptly in silence. Every clue seemed to dissolve into contradiction. The footprints, the sounds in the attic, the calmness of the animals after the slaughter. Eventually, the house was torn down, the wood and stones scattered across the region. On the spot where it once stood, a simple memorial cross now marks the site. The official files describe the crime as unsolved, closed without a name. But in the collective memory of Germany, Hinterkaifeck remains a place of unanswered dread. A reminder that sometimes horror does not arrive from the outside world, but grows quietly within the ordinary, waiting to be discovered. To this day, the murder of the Gruber family endures as one of the most haunting unsolved mysteries in history. The cold winds still move through the fields where their farm once stood, carrying with them the faint echo of footsteps, the same ones Andreas Gruber once heard in the attic, warning of something that could never be explained. The Sodder children disappearance. On Christmas Eve of 1945, in the small town of Fayetteville, West Virginia, the Sodder family went to bed after a long evening of celebration. George and Jenny Sodder had 10 children, and that night, 5 of them were asleep upstairs while the rest stayed with their parents downstairs. It was an ordinary night of warmth, laughter, and the glow of the holiday tree, until just after midnight, when everything changed. Sometime after 12:30 a.m., Jenny was awakened by the ringing of the telephone. A woman's voice asked for someone Jenny didn't know, followed by strange laughter and the clinking of glasses before the line went dead. Jenny thought little of it, assuming it was a holiday prank. But moments later, she noticed that the house was unusually quiet. The lights still on, the curtains open, the front door unlocked. Her children, who had stayed up to play with their new toys, were nowhere in sight. At 1 a.m., Jenny was startled by a loud thud on the roof, followed by the smell of smoke. Within minutes, flames spread through the hallway. George and Jenny grabbed 4 of their children and escaped into the cold night air, shouting for the others. Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, who were trapped upstairs. George tried to rush back inside, but the staircase was already engulfed. He ran to fetch his ladder, but it had mysteriously disappeared. He then tried to move his trucks near the window to climb up, but neither vehicle would start, though both had been in perfect working order the day before. Neighbors called for help, but the fire department didn't arrive until hours later, long after the house had burned to the ground. By dawn, the Sodder home was reduced to smoking rubble. In the ashes, investigators found no trace of human remains. No bones, no teeth, nothing that could account for 5 children. The official explanation was that the fire had been hot enough to completely incinerate them. But experts later testified that even in intense fires, human bones do not vanish entirely. Something about the tragedy did not add up. As the days passed, more strange details emerged. The phone line to the house had been cut, not damaged by fire. The missing ladder was found in a nearby ditch. A local telephone operator recalled seeing a car stopped along the road the night of the fire, its occupants watching the Sodder house. Jenny began to believe that her children had not died in the flames, but had been taken. George, too, could not accept the official story. He bulldozed the remains of the house and built a memorial garden where it had stood, vowing to uncover the truth. The Sodders hired private investigators, placed billboards along highways, and followed countless leads. Over the years, witnesses claimed to have seen the missing children in a motel in South Carolina, at a convent in St. Louis, or traveling with strangers. Each lead brought hope and then silence. One day, years later, Jenny received a photograph in the mail. It was of a young man with familiar eyes, folded into an envelope without a return address. On the back were the words, "Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie. Ill boys. A 90132 or 35. The handwriting was shaky, the message cryptic. The family sent the photo to the police, but nothing came of it. The man's identity was never confirmed. George and Jenny kept the photo framed on their mantle until their deaths. They never rebuilt their home, and the Christmas lights on their property remained dark for the rest of their lives. Their surviving children continued to investigate, long after the official files had been closed. Some believed the case was connected to threats George had received before the fire, after criticizing Italian dictator Benito Mussolini, an echo of the political tensions of the time. Others thought it was a tragic accident, magnified by grief and suspicion, but no explanation ever satisfied the family. The disappearance of the Sodder children remains one of America's most haunting mysteries. A house burned in the night, but the fire could not erase the questions that lingered. Was it an accident, a crime, or something in between? Today, the site where the Sodder home once stood is silent, marked only by an old billboard with the faces of the missing children. Faded by time, yet still watching the road, as if waiting for someone to come home. The lead masks case. On August 20th, 1966, a young man hiking near the city of Niterói, Brazil, made a disturbing discovery on a quiet hillside known as Morro do Vintum. Among the tall grass and scattered rocks, he found 2 bodies lying side by side. They were dressed in formal suits, their raincoats neatly folded beside them. Most unsettling of all, each man wore a strange, handmade mask of thin lead that completely covered the eyes. There were no signs of struggle, no visible injuries, and no clues to suggest what had happened. The authorities arrived soon after, along with reporters drawn by the mystery. The men were identified as Manuel Pereira de Cruz and Miguel Jose Viana, two electronic technicians from the town of Campos dos Goitacazes, over 200 kilometers away. Their pockets held no money, no weapons, and no evidence of robbery. But in one of their bags, investigators found a notebook that would deepen the enigma rather than explain it. On one of its pages, written in Portuguese, was a single instruction: 1630 at the determined place. 1830 swallow capsules. After effect, protect metals, await signal. No one could understand what it meant. The police traced the men's movements in the days before their deaths. On August 17th, they had told their families they were traveling to Sao Paulo to buy materials for work. They withdrew a modest sum of money and boarded a bus toward Niterói instead. Witnesses recalled that they appeared calm and purposeful, carrying a briefcase and a notebook. That night, they checked into a small hotel and bought raincoats from a nearby shop, despite clear weather. Later, they were seen climbing the hillside, one of them appearing anxious, glancing back toward the city as if expecting someone to follow. That was the last time they were seen alive. When the bodies were found, the coroner could not determine a cause of death. There were no signs of poisoning or violence. Unfortunately, due to delays in the investigation and the intense heat, internal organs had decomposed before proper analysis could be done. The capsules mentioned in the notebook were never found. Speculation spread rapidly. Some believed the men had been part of an experiment involving radiation or hallucinogenic substances. Others suggested they had been members of a secret spiritualist group attempting to contact extraterrestrial or metaphysical entities through energy and light. Friends told police that both men were fascinated by the idea of communicating with higher beings and had attended meetings where such experiments were discussed. They had even built devices at home designed to capture electromagnetic signals from other planes. The lead masks, investigators thought, might have been intended to shield their eyes from some form of bright light, perhaps one they believed would accompany a supernatural encounter. The instruction, "await signal," suddenly took on a chilling resonance. It was as if they had gone there to witness something extraordinary, something only they understood, and never returned. But the story contained contradictions. There was no evidence of radiation at the site, no footprints other than their own, no indication that anyone else had been with them. Their watches were stopped at 4:30 p.m., the same time noted in their mysterious message. Everything seemed to point toward a deliberate, ritual-like event, yet its purpose remained lost. Over time, the lead masks case became one of Brazil's most enduring mysteries. The hillside where the bodies were found turned into a place of quiet pilgrimage for those fascinated by the unknown. Police archives remain incomplete. The surviving photographs faded. To this day, no one knows what the men expected to see on that hill, or what kind of signal they waited for in their final moments. Perhaps they believed they were on the verge of a discovery, something that would reveal a greater truth beyond the limits of the visible world. Instead, all that was left were two figures lying in the grass, dressed for an occasion no one could name, with masks over their eyes to protect them from a light that never came. The Circleville Letters. In the mid-1970s, the small town of Circleville, Ohio, became the center of a strange and unsettling mystery. It began quietly with a single letter, handwritten, anonymous, and addressed to a local school bus driver named Mary Celeste. The letter accused her of having an affair with the superintendent of schools, and it warned her to end it immediately. The writer seemed to know intimate details about her life, where she lived, and even the schedules of her family. There was no signature, no return address, and no explanation. Mary tried to ignore the letter, believing it was a cruel prank. But soon more arrived. Each one was more threatening than the last. The writer called her a liar, a sinner, a woman who would be exposed before everyone. He claimed to watch her constantly, to know when her husband was away, to know what she did each day. Within weeks, similar letters began appearing across the town. targeting local officials and neighbors with accusations, insults, and warnings. The writer signed them simply as the Circleville writer. The letters threw the quiet farming town into chaos. People began to distrust one another. Marriages broke down. Neighbors accused neighbors. No one knew who the writer was, but the tone suggested someone from within the community, someone familiar with every rumor and secret. In August 1977, the situation escalated when Mary's husband, Ron Gillespie, received a threatening phone call. Furious, he grabbed his gun and left home, saying he was going to confront the letter writer. Moments later, his truck crashed into a tree, and he was killed instantly. The circumstances were suspicious. The truck had swerved suddenly, and his gun had fired once inside the vehicle. The sheriff ruled it an accident, but many in Circleville believed otherwise. The letters didn't stop after Ron's death. If anything, they grew bolder. Over time, suspicion began to fall on a man named Paul Freshour, Mary's brother-in-law. Paul had helped investigate the letters privately and even tested theories about who might be behind them. In 1983, Mary discovered a crude booby trap on her mail route, a box containing a gun rigged to fire when opened. The serial number had been filed off, but investigators traced it back to Paul. He denied any involvement, claiming the gun had been stolen from his garage. Nevertheless, he was arrested and convicted of attempted murder. While Paul was in prison, something inexplicable happened. The letters continued. Hundreds of them were sent not only to Circleville residents but even to the judge, reporters, and the prison warden. Each one carried the same handwriting and the same menacing tone. Paul could not have mailed them from behind bars, yet tests seemed to show that the same hand had written them. By the time Paul was released in 1994, the letters had finally stopped, leaving behind a trail of confusion and fear that lasted for nearly 2 decades. The writer was never identified. Some still believe Paul was innocent, framed by someone who wanted to keep the town in turmoil. Others think he was the writer all along, a manipulative figure who somehow found a way to continue his campaign even from confinement. The mystery of the Circleville Letters lies not only in the crime but in its atmosphere, the quiet paranoia that can consume a small community when trust collapses. It was a story about secrets, about the fear of being watched, and about the way a single anonymous voice can change the life of an entire town. Today, the letters are stored in the archives of the Pickaway County Sheriff's Office. Their ink faded but their tones still sharp, each one a reminder of how easily ordinary lives can be invaded by the unseen hand of obsession. Circleville has long returned to peace, but somewhere in the history of that small Ohio town, the shadow of an anonymous writer still lingers. A voice that knew too much and never revealed its face. The toxic woman Gloria Ramirez. On the evening of February 19, 1994, a woman named Gloria Ramirez was brought into the emergency room of Riverside General Hospital in California. She was just 31 years old, a mother of 2, and suffering from the late stages of cervical cancer. Her breathing was shallow, her pulse was weak, and her skin glistened with an oily sheen. The nurses moved quickly to stabilize her, administering oxygen, sedatives, and 4 fluids. But within minutes of her arrival, something happened that would turn a routine emergency into one of the strangest medical mysteries in modern history. As the staff worked around her, several of them began to feel dizzy and nauseous. One nurse noticed an odd, garlic-like odor coming from Gloria's mouth. Another described a chemical smell like ammonia. When a syringe of her blood was drawn, a thick, oily haze seemed to float inside the tube, and small crystalline particles were seen forming within it. Suddenly, one of the nurses collapsed. Then another. Then a doctor. Within minutes, the emergency room was in chaos as medical professionals fell unconscious one by one. The hospital declared an internal emergency and evacuated the ER. A skeleton crew remained behind in protective masks, trying desperately to save Gloria's life. But at 8:50 p.m., she went into cardiac arrest and could not be revived. Gloria Ramirez was pronounced dead. Yet the terror inside the hospital had only begun. Over 23 staff members reported symptoms of exposure: dizziness, shortness of breath, muscle spasms, even temporary paralysis. 6 were hospitalized. One nurse remained in intensive care for nearly 2 weeks, suffering from hepatitis-like symptoms and bone marrow suppression. The room where Gloria had died was sealed off, and the coroner's office was ordered to handle her body with extreme caution. Investigators arrived in hazmat suits, treating the case as a possible toxic contamination event. But what exactly had poisoned the hospital staff? No one could agree. Some suspected exposure to dangerous chemotherapy byproducts from Gloria's cancer treatment. Others believed she had accidentally ingested or applied a household chemical that interacted with her medication. The strangest theory came from a team of scientists at the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory who proposed that Gloria might have been using a pain relief substance called dimethyl sulfoxide, DMSO. In the 1960s, DMSO was a popular home remedy, a solvent with anti-inflammatory properties. It could be found in many households, though its medical use had been banned due to safety concerns. According to the lab's hypothesis, Gloria may have applied DMSO to her skin to ease her pain. Under the stress of illness, her kidneys might have stopped filtering it properly, allowing the chemical to build up in her system. When paramedics gave her oxygen in the ambulance, the DMSO could have oxidized into dimethyl sulfone, a compound that forms crystals at room temperature, matching what the staff had seen in her blood. Under the bright lights and electric shocks of the ER's defibrillators, this substance might have converted into another compound, dimethyl sulfate, a highly toxic gas capable of causing exactly the symptoms reported by the medical team. The theory fit some of the evidence, but not all of it. The levels required for such a reaction seemed almost impossible to achieve within the human body, and the toxicology tests on Gloria's remains showed no clear sign of these compounds. The official autopsy was delayed for weeks while her body was stored in a sealed, temperature-controlled chamber. By the time it was completed, decomposition had advanced to the point that many potential chemical traces were lost. Her family protested the handling of her remains, accusing the authorities of hiding the truth. In the end, the cause of the hospital contamination was listed as undetermined. The DMSO theory remained the most widely accepted, though never proven beyond doubt. Some believe the event was a mass psychogenic episode, a collective physical reaction triggered by stress and fear. Others maintain that the government suppressed a more disturbing explanation involving experimental toxins or medical waste leaks. What is certain is that something real happened that night, something that caused trained professionals to faint, tremble, and collapse in the presence of a dying woman. Gloria Ramirez became known as the Toxic Lady, a tragic symbol of how science can sometimes reach the edge of what it understands. Years later, the staff who were present that night still described vivid memories. The metallic smell, the sense of confusion, the eerie quiet that followed her death. For Gloria's family, the label of toxic never felt fair. To them, she was a mother, a sister, a woman who had suffered greatly and whose final moments were turned into a public enigma. Her story remains unsolved, a haunting intersection of chemistry, medicine, and the unknown. Even decades later, researchers revisit the case, hoping to uncover what truly happened in that emergency room. Yet the truth remains elusive, suspended in the air like the invisible gas that may or may not have existed, lingering long after the last light in the ER was turned off. The Bennington Triangle. In the quiet, forested heart of Vermont lies a stretch of land that seems ordinary at first glance. Between the small towns of Bennington and Woodford, deep in the shadow of Glastonbury Mountain, time itself appears to distort. Between 1945 and 1950, several people disappeared here without a trace. The events were never explained, and the area eventually earned a name that would live in local folklore, the Bennington Triangle. The first to vanish was Midday Rivers, an experienced hunting guide who knew every inch of these woods. In November 1945, he was leading a group of hunters through the mountains. On the way back to camp, he walked a few steps ahead of the others and simply disappeared. Searchers spent weeks combing the forest. No footprints, no clothing, no signs of an animal attack. It was as though the forest had swallowed him whole. A year later, in December 1946, 18-year-old Paula Jean Weldon, a student at Bennington College, set off for an afternoon hike along the long trail. She was seen by several witnesses that day, walking calmly along the path in her red coat. But when night fell and she did not return, an enormous search began. Planes flew overhead, hundreds of volunteers swept the woods, and dogs followed her scent until it stopped abruptly near a crossroads. No trace of her was ever found. In 1949, another disappearance added to the mystery. James Tedford, a veteran returning by bus to the Bennington soldiers' home, vanished during the journey. Passengers recalled seeing him sitting quietly near the back, reading. But when the bus reached Bennington, he was gone. His luggage remained on the rack above his seat, and his ticket was still in his pocket. In October 1950, 8-year-old Paul Jepson was playing near his family's truck while his mother tended to animals on their farm. When she returned, he had vanished. His tracks led up a short hill before stopping suddenly, as though he had stepped off the earth itself. Bloodhounds followed his scent to the same area near Glastonbury Mountain, and then it disappeared, just as it had in the previous cases. Only weeks later, in the same year, 53-year-old hiker Frida Langer went missing while walking with her cousin near Somerset Reservoir. She slipped into a stream and returned to camp to change her clothes. She promised to be back soon, but she never arrived. For months, the area was searched over and over with no results. 7 months later, her body was discovered in a place that had already been searched many times. The cause of death could not be determined. 5 people, all lost in a small, isolated region over 5 years. Some were young, others old. Some vanished in daylight, others in fog or rain. Yet in every case, there were no answers, no evidence of crime, no signs of panic, no resolution. The pattern felt unnatural, as though something unseen had been drawing people in and erasing them from the map. Long before these disappearances, Native American legends warned against visiting Glastonbury Mountain. The tribe spoke of strange winds, of whispers in the trees, and of spirits that lured travelers into the forest. Even modern hikers report strange sensations: compasses spinning erratically, sudden changes in the weather, or an overwhelming sense of being watched. Some say the disappearances can be explained by the landscape itself: deep mine shafts, wild animals, or sudden changes in weather. Others believe there is something else, something the forest keeps hidden. What makes the Bennington Triangle so haunting is not just the missing people, but the silence that followed. Each case fades into the next, connected only by uncertainty. Today, few venture deep into those woods alone. The trees still stand as they did decades ago, their branches heavy with mist. The air grows colder near the mountain, and the forest floor absorbs every sound. There are places where footsteps seem to vanish, where the wind pauses, and where time feels heavier than it should. No one knows what really happened to those who disappeared between the mountains of Bennington. But those who enter the forest say they can feel it, the quiet pull of something that waits beneath the trees, patient and unseen, guarding its secrets in the endless stillness of the Vermont wilderness. The Mary Celeste. In December of 1872, a British brigantine named the Dei Grazia was sailing through the Atlantic Ocean when its crew spotted another vessel drifting silently in the open water. The ship was the Mary Celeste, an American merchant brig that had left New York 8 days before them. At first glance, the vessel seemed normal, her sails partially set, her course steady. But as the crew approached, an uneasy feeling began to grow. Something wasn't right. When they boarded the Mary Celeste, the silence was overwhelming. There was no sign of life. The crew's personal belongings were untouched. Clothes neatly folded, tobacco pipes left on tables, and a sewing machine mid-use, as if someone had just stepped away for a moment. The ship's cargo of alcohol barrels was intact. There was no evidence of struggle, no blood, no damage from a storm. The lifeboat, however, was missing. Captain Benjamin Briggs, his wife Sarah, their 2-year-old daughter Sophia, and 7 experienced crew members had vanished. The captain's log entries were calm and routine up until November 25th, describing steady winds and no signs of distress. By the time the Dei Grazia found her, the Mary Celeste had been drifting aimlessly for over a week, more than 400 miles from her intended course. What made the mystery so haunting was the sheer absence of chaos. Food was still laid out in the galley. The ship's hold was dry and secure. The crew's valuables, including money, were untouched. The only irregularities were a missing lifeboat, a disassembled pump, and a single open hatch. The sails were slightly damaged, and a few ropes dangled into the sea, but nothing suggested catastrophe. When the Mary Celeste was towed back to port, investigators searched for answers. Some suspected pirates, yet nothing was stolen. Others proposed that the crew abandoned ship due to an explosion risk. The cargo consisted of 1,701 barrels of denatured alcohol, and some barrels were found leaking. Perhaps Captain Briggs feared toxic fumes and ordered everyone into the lifeboat temporarily, intending to return once the air cleared. If so, a sudden gust or strong current could have separated the small boat from the ship, leaving them stranded in the vast Atlantic. Still, other theories veered into the strange. Some believed in underwater earthquakes or sudden rogue waves, though the calm weather reports contradicted this. Over the years, tales of sea monsters, ghost ships, and supernatural forces attached themselves to the story. Newspapers exaggerated the details, describing eerie dinners left untouched and phantom sightings of the Mary Celeste sailing unmanned across the horizon. But the truth, if there ever was one, remains lost at sea. The ship itself continued to sail for years under different owners, none of whom met a fortunate end. Each voyage seemed to carry bad luck. Financial ruin, strange accidents, and unexplained events followed her until she was deliberately wrecked off Haiti in 1885. Even then, her final captain tried to commit insurance fraud and drowned soon after, as though cursed by the ship's legacy. The story of the Mary Celeste endures because it speaks to something primal, the fear of vanishing without reason, of being erased by the vastness of the world. In an age where every voyage was a gamble with the unknown, the sight of a perfectly intact ship drifting alone in the endless ocean felt like a whisper from something beyond comprehension. The Mary Celeste sails still in the imagination, a ghostly image on the calm sea, its decks empty, its sails quietly flapping in the wind. The waves lap against its hull, carrying with them the question that has haunted sailors for over a century. What happened to those who set out across the water and never returned? The Isdal Woman. On a cold November morning in 1970, deep within the Isdalen Valley near Bergen, Norway, a man and his two daughters were hiking when they stumbled upon something strange. Lying among the blackened rocks of a remote hiking trail was the charred body of a woman. Around her were strange items, fragments of clothing with all the labels removed, a broken umbrella, an empty bottle of liquor, and a small silver spoon engraved with a pattern that led nowhere. Her body had been carefully arranged, her arms folded across her chest, as though placed there deliberately. The police arrived quickly, but from the beginning, the case defied logic. The woman's fingerprints had been sanded off. Her dental records were from no known country. There were no identifying documents, no luggage tags, and no one who came forward to claim her. In a pair of nearby suitcases found at Bergen railway station, investigators discovered a collection of wigs, prescription glasses with different strengths, and notepads filled with cryptic codes. She had stayed in several hotels across Norway under various false names, all similar but never the same. Fenella Lorch, Vera Schlosseneck, Elizabeth Lienhauer. Each identity was carefully crafted, each address false. Witnesses remembered her as elegant, quiet, and always alone. Some said she spoke fluent French and German. Others noted an accent that was hard to place. She traveled light, paid in cash, and left no trace of who she truly was. The autopsy revealed that she had died from a combination of carbon monoxide poisoning and sleeping pills. But what puzzled investigators most was the state of her body. Her clothes had been doused in gasoline, and though burned, the fire seemed strangely contained. The scene looked staged, as if someone had wanted her found, or perhaps wanted to make sure no one could ever know who she really was. As police pieced together her movements, they realized she had been traveling across Europe for months before her death. She visited remote locations near military installations and testing sites, often under different names. Norwegian intelligence briefly considered the possibility that she was a spy, perhaps connected to the Cold War, which at that time divided the continent with secrecy and fear. Yet no agency ever confirmed her identity. and no missing person matched her description. Her coded notes were eventually deciphered as records of her travels, dates, places, and abbreviations for train routes. Nothing incriminating, but the pattern suggested a deliberate and methodical lifestyle, the kind kept by someone who couldn't afford mistakes. Years later, when her case was reopened, modern forensic testing provided small clues. Analysis of her teeth and jaw suggested she had grown up in Central Europe, perhaps in or near Germany. Chemical traces in her bones showed she had lived in multiple regions throughout her life. Despite these findings, her true identity remains unknown. Even her burial carried an air of mystery. In February 1971, she was laid to rest in Bergen under the simple inscription, "Here lies an unknown woman, found dead in Isdal, November 29, 1970. Police officers, journalists, and a few curious locals attended. No family came. Her coffin was sealed in zinc, a practice sometimes used for those whose remains might one day be exhumed. Over time, the Isdal Woman became part of Norwegian folklore, a symbol of the Cold War's lingering shadows and the hidden lives that crossed borders unseen. Her story has inspired countless theories. Espionage, political cover-ups, even suggestions of secret identities erased by intelligence agencies. Yet none of these explanations bring peace to the haunting image of her final moments. Alone in a cold valley, surrounded by fire and silence. More than half a century later, her mystery endures. In a world obsessed with information, she remains a ghost from an era of secrets. The Isdal Woman, nameless, faceless, and timeless, is a reminder that even in our most connected age, some lives slip completely beyond the reach of memory, leaving behind only traces that refuse to fade. The Boy in the Box. On a cold February day in 1957, in a quiet suburb of Philadelphia, a young man wandering through the woods came across a cardboard box discarded near the road. Inside lay the small, lifeless body of a boy, wrapped in a plain blanket. His hair had been crudely cut. His skin bore bruises, and his eyes were closed as if caught between sleep and silence. No one knew who he was. No one came forward to claim him. And for decades, the world knew him only as the boy in the box. The scene offered little to work with. The box had once held a baby's bassinet, purchased from a local department store. The boy was between 3 and 7 years old, undernourished, and appeared to have suffered from long-term neglect. His body had been carefully cleaned, nails trimmed, face washed, as if someone had tried to prepare him, not to discard him in the wilderness, but to conceal the truth. Detectives launched one of the most exhaustive investigations in Philadelphia's history. Thousands of flyers bearing the boy's photograph were distributed across the city and surrounding states. Posters were placed in police stations, post offices, and gas stations. His fingerprints and footprints were compared to hospital and adoption records, yet no match was found. Every missing child report from across the country was checked, but nothing aligned. Even the smallest clues became objects of obsession. The blanket he was wrapped in was traced to a factory that had sold thousands like it across the region. The box was tracked to a store in Upper Darby. The haircut, uneven and rushed, suggested it had been done shortly before death, perhaps to alter his appearance. Investigators combed through orphanages, hospitals, and foster homes. They interviewed families, neighbors, and anyone who might have seen a child suddenly vanish. Still, nothing emerged. Years passed, and the case faded into the background, yet it refused to die. New leads surfaced, each stranger than the last. One woman claimed she had seen the boy alive, trapped in an abusive foster home. Another insisted he was her son, kidnapped years before. Some theories painted the crime as the work of a desperate mother, others as a tragic accident hidden by shame. None of these claims held up under scrutiny. The boy remained nameless. What made the mystery so haunting was the compassion it inspired. Detectives who worked the case long after retirement would still visit his small grave marked simply as America's Unknown Child. People left flowers, toys, and letters, as if trying to give him the love he never received in life. Journalists and forensic artists continued their search, reconstructing his face, imagining his voice, wondering what kind of life he might have lived. Decades later, advances in DNA technology brought new hope. In 2022, after years of testing and genealogical research, the boy's identity was finally revealed. His name was Joseph Augustus Zarelli. He was 4 years old. The discovery offered a fragment of closure, but also reopened the pain of the story. His parents had both died years earlier, and while investigators now knew who he was, they still didn't know why. The mystery of how Joseph came to rest in that box, and who was responsible, remains unresolved. The answers may never come, but the decades of searching, the compassion of strangers, and the refusal to let him be forgotten turned a tragedy into something quietly human. The boy in the box is no longer unknown. Yet his story endures not just as a crime, but as a reflection of the need to remember those who fall through the cracks of history. The voices too small to be heard, the names too easily lost. His silence spoke for generations, and in that silence, people found the echo of their own humanity. The Somerton Man. On the morning of December 1st, 1948, the body of a man was found lying on Somerton Beach, near Adelaide, Australia. He was dressed neatly in a suit and polished shoes, his head resting gently against the seawall as though asleep. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, and nothing to suggest violence. Yet within his pockets, investigators would uncover one of the strangest mysteries in modern history, one that remains unsolved to this day. The man carried no wallet, no identification, and all the labels had been carefully removed from his clothing. His tie was tightly knotted, and his hands were relaxed at his sides. In one pocket was a used bus ticket, a train stub, a comb, a pack of chewing gum, and a box of cigarettes containing a different brand than the label suggested. Nothing seemed to fit together, and none of it revealed who he was. When the autopsy was performed, doctors found that the man's organs were strangely congested, and his stomach contained traces of a substance believed to be poison, though no toxin could ever be identified. He was healthy, in his mid-40s, athletic, and apparently in good physical condition. There was no evidence of a struggle or trauma. He had simply died where he lay, his face calm and expressionless. Then, weeks later, investigators made a discovery that deepened the mystery. Hidden in a small, secret pocket of his trousers was a tightly rolled piece of paper. On it were 2 words printed in elegant script: Tamam Shud. The phrase, Persian in origin, translates to "it is finished" or "ended." The fragment was later traced to a rare book of poetry, the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. When police searched for a matching copy, a local man came forward with one that had been found mysteriously placed in his car, parked near the site where the body was discovered. Inside that book was a series of letters, arranged like a code, and a phone number that led to a young nurse named Jessica Thompson. She lived just a few hundred meters from Somerton Beach. When police questioned her, she denied knowing the man but reacted with visible shock when shown his cast death mask. So much so that one investigator later described her as nearly fainting. She refused to speak further, and her connection to the man, if there was one, was never proven. The cipher found in the book has never been definitively decoded. Cryptographers and intelligence experts have analyzed it for decades, debating whether it was a random sequence, a personal message, or an intelligence code. Some believe the Somerton Man may have been a spy. The Cold War had already begun, and Adelaide was near several key military research sites. Others think it was a case of suicide, linked to a personal relationship that ended in tragedy. Over the years, his case continued to fascinate and confound. No missing persons matched his description. His fingerprints and dental records yielded nothing. In 1949, he was buried under a simple headstone that read, "Here lies the unknown man found at Somerton Beach, December 1st, 1948. In 2022, modern DNA analysis finally gave him a name: Carl Charles Webb, an electrical engineer and instrument maker from Melbourne. Yet even with his identity revealed, the story remained incomplete. No one knows how he came to be on that beach, why his labels were cut from his clothes, or how he died. The Somerton Man's story is one of those rare enigmas where every answer only deepens the uncertainty. It is a mystery suspended between love, espionage, and coincidence. a story that continues to live in whispers and speculation, half in history and half in myth. Even now, more than 70 years later, the image of that man resting silently on the sand endures. A stranger who arrived with no past and left behind a question that may never be resolved. The Villisca Axe Murders. In the small town of Villisca, Iowa, a summer night in 1912 turned into one of the darkest mysteries in American history. It began on June 10th, when neighbors noticed that the Moore family home was strangely quiet. Curtains were drawn, no one was outside, and the usual morning sounds, the clatter of chores, the laughter of children, were missing. Concerned, a neighbor entered the house and found a scene that would haunt the town forever. Inside, the entire Moore family, Josiah and Sarah, their 4 children, and 2 young guests who had stayed the night, were found brutally murdered in their beds. All 8 victims had been struck with an axe, the blunt side of the blade leaving deep marks. Every mirror in the house had been covered with cloths or clothing, and every window had been blocked from view. The killer had moved calmly from room to room, extinguishing lamps and leaving behind a silence so complete that not a single neighbor had woken during the night. What baffled investigators was the meticulous, almost ritualistic nature of the crime. The axe was found leaning against a wall, wiped clean of fingerprints. A plate of uneaten food sat on the table beside a bowl of bloody water, as if the killer had washed his hands before leaving. All doors were locked from the inside. There was no sign of forced entry, no theft, and no clear motive. The Moore family had been well-liked, active in their church and community. Earlier that day, they had attended a local Children's Day program. Witnesses remembered seeing them leave the church around 9:30 p.m. They walked home under the warm glow of gas lamps, unaware that it would be their last night alive. By morning, the house stood still, its secrets sealed in darkness. When word spread, Villisca descended into panic. Reporters from across the country flooded the town, and the Moore home became the center of national attention. Investigators struggled to maintain order as curious townspeople crowded the property, some even stepping inside and touching evidence before it could be collected. The case was soon compromised by chaos and fear. Over the following years, multiple suspects were arrested and questioned. One was a traveling preacher named Reverend George Kelly, who had been in Villisca that night and left town early the next morning. He was said to be eccentric and had written letters to police confessing, then retracting his confession. Another suspect was a local businessman with a possible grudge against Josiah Moore. Yet despite 2 trials and years of investigation, no one was ever convicted. Each theory ended in confusion, each suspect either released or acquitted. What made the murders so unsettling was their senselessness. There was no robbery, no sign of personal conflict, only an overwhelming quiet that followed the violence. The killer's calm precision suggested either experience or madness, perhaps both. The town's residents began to lock their doors at night for the first time. Rumors spread of a drifter, a stranger on a train, a curse. As time passed, the Moore house became more than just a crime scene. It turned into a monument of unanswered questions. Even today, it still stands, carefully preserved, visited by those drawn to the unknown. Locals say the air inside feels heavy, as though the walls remember what happened. The Villisca Axe Murders remain one of the most haunting unsolved crimes in American history. A family erased in one night, a killer who vanished without trace, and a town left with nothing but shadows. More than a century later, the quiet of that Iowa home still carries the echo of that night. A silence deeper than words, heavy with the weight of what will never be known. The toxic reign of Oakville. In August 1994, the residents of Oakville, Washington, awoke to a morning unlike any they had seen before. Instead of rain, a strange, translucent substance fell from the sky. Small gelatinous blobs that clung to rooftops, cars, and the ground. It was soft, slippery, and unlike anything anyone had ever touched. As people walked outside, confusion quickly gave way to concern. This was not ordinary weather. Something was wrong. At first, the townspeople thought it might be industrial fallout or pollution from nearby aircraft. Yet there were no reports of spills, no alerts from authorities. The substance kept falling intermittently for several days, coating the quiet rural town in a ghostly sheen. When residents began to fall ill, complaining of fatigue, dizziness, nausea, and severe respiratory distress, the mystery turned into fear. Even animals began to suffer. Cats and dogs that came into contact with the jelly-like material became lethargic or died soon after. Local law enforcement collected samples and sent them to laboratories for testing. What scientists found deepened the puzzle. The rain contained living cells, biological in structure, but missing nuclei, making them distinct from typical animal or human cells. They were not plant matter, not fungi, not bacteria in the usual sense. It seemed alive but alien, and no one could explain how such material could fall from the sky in such volume. Some officials speculated that the substance might be waste dumped from an airplane toilet system, but aviation authorities quickly dismissed this theory. The volume and frequency of the falls made it impossible. Others suggested it could be jellyfish remains carried into the clouds by a storm over the ocean, a theory that captured public imagination but was biologically improbable. Still, no better explanation emerged. Soon, whispers began circulating around Oakville. The town lay not far from a military training area used for bombing exercises over the Pacific Ocean. Several residents remembered hearing low-flying military aircraft around the times the rain appeared. Some began to wonder if this was fallout from weapons testing, or perhaps a form of biological experiment gone wrong. The U.S. military denied all involvement, yet provided no data to confirm or deny that aircraft had been flying nearby. The phenomenon repeated itself 6 times over the following 3 weeks. Each episode brought another wave of sickness, confusion, and speculation. Reporters arrived from across the country, interviewing doctors, residents, and local officials. Samples were sent to independent laboratories, including the Washington State Department of Health. The results were inconclusive. Some claimed the material contained white blood cells. Others said it was a mix of organic compounds that did not correspond to any known biological category. No 2 analyses matched. As weeks turned into months, the mystery faded from national headlines, leaving Oakville's residents with more questions than answers. The illnesses subsided, but unease lingered. Many who had been sick believed they had been exposed to something deliberately released, a form of biological test hidden under the guise of a natural event. There were even rumors that local military activity abruptly ceased following the media attention, though no official records confirmed it. Years later, a few samples of the Oakville blobs, as they came to be known, still existed in laboratory freezers. Independent researchers occasionally re-examined them, but each analysis yielded conflicting results. The samples degraded over time, and with them the hope of ever learning the truth. To this day, scientists cannot fully explain what fell from the sky that August. The event remains one of the most perplexing unsolved environmental mysteries in modern American history. Some call it a natural phenomenon, others a secret experiment. But for those who lived through it, who watched their town shrouded in a rain of living gel, the memory is far from scientific. It is a story of uncertainty, fear, and the realization that sometimes what falls from the heavens may not belong there at all. And even now, when heavy clouds gather over Oakville, a few residents still look skyward with quiet apprehension, remembering the time when the rain itself seemed alive. The Murder of Elisa Lam. In February 2013, the world became captivated by a haunting mystery that unfolded within the walls of Los Angeles' notorious Cecil Hotel, the tragic and inexplicable death of a young woman named Elisa Lam. She was a 21-year-old student from Vancouver, Canada, traveling alone through California, documenting her journey online with cheerful posts and photographs. But her trip, filled with youthful curiosity, ended in a story that blurred the line between reality and nightmare. The Cecil Hotel had long carried a dark reputation. Built in the 1920s as a symbol of glamour, it had since become a haven for the desperate and the lost. Located near the troubled district of Skid Row, it had witnessed decades of violence, despair, and mystery. It was there on January 26, 2013, that Elisa checked in unaware of the building's infamous past. For several days, she called her family regularly, describing her trip and her plans. But on February 1st, the calls stopped. Her parents grew worried and contacted the Los Angeles Police Department. Soon, officers arrived at the Cecil to investigate, but Elisa was nowhere to be found. The search began quietly, but everything changed when the police released footage from one of the hotel's security cameras. The video recorded inside the elevator was strange and disturbing. In it, Elisa appears to behave erratically. She presses multiple buttons, hides in the corner, peeks out into the hallway, and makes unusual hand movements, as though speaking to someone unseen. Then, she steps outside, disappears from view, and the elevator doors remain open for what feels like an eternity. The footage went viral, sparking countless theories across the internet. Some believed she was running from someone. Others thought she was under the influence of drugs or suffering a mental episode. And a few suggested something darker, something supernatural. Weeks later, guests at the Cecil began to complain about low water pressure, dark discoloration, and a strange taste coming from the taps. On February 19th, a hotel maintenance worker climbed to the roof to check the water tanks. When he opened one of them, he made a horrifying discovery. Floating inside the dark, cold water was the body of Elisa Lam. The circumstances were baffling. The rooftop was locked and alarmed, accessible only to staff. The water tanks were large, heavy, and difficult to climb into, even harder to seal from the inside. Her clothes were found floating nearby, along with traces of sand and debris. The autopsy revealed no signs of assault or drug use, and the cause of death was ruled as accidental drowning. But the details left investigators, and the public, deeply unsettled. How had she reached the roof without triggering alarms? How did she manage to climb into the tank and close the heavy lid? And why was her behavior in the elevator so inexplicable? Every explanation seemed incomplete. Some pointed to her documented history of bipolar disorder, suggesting she may have experienced a psychotic episode. Others argued that there must have been foul play, a missing piece of evidence that never surfaced. Over time, theories multiplied. Some speculated about hotel residents or staff involvement. Others noted eerie coincidences, such as the 2005 horror film Dark Water, which featured a girl found dead in a rooftop water tank of a rundown apartment building. Conspiracy theorists even tied the event to disease outbreaks that occurred nearby, as though the mystery extended beyond one person's tragedy. Yet, behind all the speculation lay a human story, that of a young woman, far from home, who vanished into one of the most infamous places in Los Angeles. Her death transformed the Cecil Hotel's already sinister reputation into legend, joining decades of strange deaths, disappearances, and inexplicable events within its walls. Today, the hotel has been rebranded, its name changed in an attempt to escape the past. But for many, the image of Elisa Lam's final moments, the flickering security footage, the silent elevator, the unanswered questions, remains one of the most chilling and unforgettable true mysteries of the modern age. Even now, as the city sleeps, the story of Elisa Lam lingers in the public consciousness. An unsettling reminder that some mysteries resist all logic, and that the darkest stories often unfold where ordinary life seems most familiar. The Ghost Blimp Incident. On the morning of August 16, 1942, the quiet fog of Daly City, California, was disturbed by a strange and unforgettable sight. A Navy blimp, drifting aimlessly through the sky with no one at the controls. It hovered low over rooftops, its engines still humming softly, its crew nowhere to be seen. As it floated over the city, it scraped against power lines, tore into the side of a house, and came to rest in the middle of a street. The crash caused little damage, and miraculously, no one was hurt. But what rescuers found inside, or rather, didn't find, would spark one of the most perplexing aviation mysteries in American history. The blimp, officially designated L8, had taken off that morning from Treasure Island in San Francisco Bay. Aboard were two experienced naval officers, Lieutenant Ernest Cody and Ensign Charles Adams. Their mission was routine, a coastal patrol searching for enemy submarines along the Pacific coast. It was the height of World War II, and such flights were common, meant to protect shipping lanes from possible attacks. At 6 a.m., the L-8 lifted into the sky, its helium envelope shimmering faintly in the morning mist. Everything appeared normal. At 7:42 a.m., Cody radioed in, reporting that they had spotted an oil slick near the Farallon Islands, about 30 miles west of San Francisco. They planned to investigate. That was the last anyone ever heard from them. When contact with the blimp was lost, naval stations tried repeatedly to reach it, but there was no response. Several hours later, witnesses along the California coast began to report sightings of a blimp flying unusually low and slowly, drifting toward land. It seemed intact, though strangely quiet. Some said they saw no one in the gondola. Others noticed that its control cables were slack, as though it were floating without purpose. At around 11 a.m., the blimp came down over Daly City. Its envelope began losing helium, and it collapsed partially onto the roofs below. Firefighters and Navy personnel rushed to the scene. Inside the gondola, they found something eerie. The cabin door was open, the engines were running, and the radio was in working order. Cody and Adams's parachutes and life vests were still there, along with their caps, a fully functional machine gun, and a payload of depth charges. There was no sign of struggle, no damage, and no indication that either man had tried to leave the craft in distress. The mystery deepened as investigators examined the scene. The blimp's safety mechanisms were intact. The radio had been tuned to the correct frequency, suggesting the men had not tried to send a distress signal. The controls were set for level flight, and there were no weather conditions severe enough to force an emergency exit. The most baffling detail was that the blimp's cabin door was locked in the open position, a setting that could only be changed from inside. In the days that followed, search parties scoured the coastline and ocean, looking for any trace of the missing crew. Not a single piece of evidence was found, no life rafts, no bodies, no debris. The ocean had swallowed every clue. Theories began to emerge. Some believed that one of the men had fallen overboard while inspecting the oil slick, and the other had jumped in a desperate rescue attempt. Others suspected sabotage or enemy interference, though there was no sign of conflict. A few suggested that the helium leak might have caused disorientation or unconsciousness, but the cabin's condition made this unlikely. The Navy eventually ruled the case as unexplained disappearance, and the L-8 blimp was repaired and put back into service. It continued to fly for years under a new name, but its ghostly history followed it wherever it went. The incident became known among sailors as the Ghost Blimp, a story whispered in hangars and briefing rooms, a reminder of how, even in times of advanced machinery and discipline, the ocean and sky can still erase people without a trace. To this day, no definitive explanation has ever been found. The fate of Lieutenant Cody and Ensign Adams remains one of aviation's enduring enigmas. Two men who vanished from a fully functioning aircraft in calm weather, leaving behind an empty vessel that flew itself home. And sometimes, on foggy mornings along the California coast, people say they still imagine the shape of a silent blimp gliding through the mist, a ghost from another time, carrying the unanswered questions of those it left behind. Ending. And so, we reach the end of our journey through some of the most haunting and forgotten true stories ever told. From vanished crews and mysterious deaths to impossible phenomena and unanswered questions. Each tale reminds us how fragile the boundary between the known and the unknown truly is. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like. It helps the channel grow and lets me know you'd like to see more stories like these. Subscribe, so you won't miss future episodes where we explore the strange, the eerie, and the unexplained. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Which story fascinated you the most? Do you believe there's a rational explanation behind them, or something deeper still waiting in the dark? I love reading your perspectives and theories. And if you know someone who enjoys chilling mysteries or late-night stories, share this video with them. Maybe it'll keep them awake, or help them drift off into strange dreams. Thank you for watching. Take care of yourself, sleep well, and as always, sweet dreams.